Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good one and welcome back to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. Can I really welcome you back to another episode of Mingles with Jingles? That doesn't make sense, does it? Me no England, language is hard. Anyway, welcome back anyway. And while the Steam Summer Sale may be over, this month's Humble Bundle has a couple of bargains. As is fairly typical with a Humble Bundle, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that you've probably never heard of, mixed in with some stuff that you probably have. But that doesn't mean that the stuff you've never heard of is bad. I mean, maybe some of it is, but some of it definitely is not. One of the titles in the Humble Bundle that I'd never heard of was called Death's Door. Apparently it's a bit of a mix of Zelda and Dark Souls, and it won the Best Indie title at the 2021 Game Awards. Apparently it also got an 81% review on PC Gamer. This month's Humble Bundle also includes Demon Ex Machina, Wizard with a Gun, Cat Quest 2, Neocab, Ever After Falls, Blank, and of course the big headline title, Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader. Some of these titles are normally priced at around the $50 price point. Rogue Trader certainly is. But with this month's bundle you can get all of those titles for less than $20. And unless I'm very much mistaken, there's an expansion coming out for Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, so this is probably the best opportunity, if you haven't already got the game, to get your hands on it, ready for the expansion. In a spot of comedy tech news, you might have noticed, there's been some big news this week, let me just put it that way. And at the risk of everything getting all political, it probably hasn't escaped your attention that Twitter's AI agent Grok has been making a bit of a name for itself this week by referring to itself as Mecha Hitler, and has been spouting all kinds of pro-Nazi nonsense. This is not the first time that Grok has had some issues. Just a couple of months ago in May, Grok suddenly one day wouldn't stop harping on about white genocide and South African politics until somebody at Twitter pulled the switch. Which is what just happened this week after Grok started going on about Mecha Hitler and how, even though I've already said his name, the Austrian gentleman whose name you're not allowed to say on YouTube would be the perfect person to sort out all of today's problems. Nevertheless, despite this, I think this is the third time now Grok has gone all Nazi on us. So whatever they did to fix it the last two times clearly hasn't stuck. But despite all this hasn't stopped Elon Musk going onto Twitter, yes, I know, I refuse to call it X, banging the drum about just how amazing Grok is. Just a couple of days ago being quoted as saying, "I would expect Grok to literally discover new technologies that are actually useful no later than next year, and maybe end of this year. And it might discover new physics next year, and within 2 years almost certainly. So just let that sink in." This from the man who's been promising self-driving cars next year, every year for the last 10 years. Yeah, I think we're just going to take that one with a pinch of salt, Elon. But, don't let that stop you. You carry on. In other slightly more directly gaming-related news, you're probably aware that I and several 100,000, perhaps even million other people have been playing quite a bit of Dune Awakening recently. You may also be aware that it's been having some issues, notably with endgame content. So, to cut a very long story short, you start playing Dune Awakening, and it is an excellent, massively multiplayer, online, although you really don't have to interact with other players unless you want to, and most of the time you probably won't, survival-based MMO, where you go out scavenging for resources, building your base and your vehicles and your weapons and your armour and all that sort of stuff. You know the drill. There's any number of different games like it, except this is the only one set in the Dune universe. So you spend dozens of hours going out scavenging, exploring, looting resources, fighting non-player characters, until eventually you reach the point where the resources that you need to build bigger and better stuff are only to be found in the deep desert outside of the main map. And this is where Dune Awakening ran into its big problem, because right up until that point, almost exclusively what you've been playing is, to all intents and purposes, a single-player survival, base-building, resource-gathering game. But as soon as you reach the end game and you head into the deep desert, suddenly you're playing a hardcore player-versus-player game. because all of the endgame resources are located in the deep desert, and the deep desert is a player versus player zone. So you've been playing what is, to all intents and purposes, a single-player PvE survival game, and then suddenly it isn't. You can understand why people might get a bit upset. To the developers' credit, Funcom did address this issue. And also, just to speak out in defence of Funcom here, it's not like they tried to hide this. It was always the case that endgame in Dune Awakening was deep desert PvP. They never tried to hide this. And honestly, if everybody playing Dune Awakening was doing so with the intention of getting into endgame PvP, it would probably be great. Unfortunately, the majority of players are not. And so, yeah, you can't really blame Funcom for this. I mean, they've always said that's what the game was going to be. And, suddenly people are complaining, but this isn't what I signed up for. Well, actually it kind of is, but nevertheless, Funcom very, very quickly did come to a compromise. And I have to give them credit for this. So what they've done is that the deep desert in Dune Awakening has been split in two. Half of it is a PvP zone, and the other half is not. So everybody who got to the stage where, in order to advance any further and get better gear and better equipment and vehicles and so on, meant going into the deep desert and getting the resources there, you can now do that without having to engage in player versus player combat. So everybody's happy. Well, not exactly. First, let's talk about the PvP. The problem with endgame PvP in Dune Awakening is that it's kind of shit. You see, what Funcom hoped was going to happen was that as soon as people got into the endgame, they were going to join PvP guilds, and then there'd be organised guild player versus player activities, fighting in support of various different noble houses, different factions, coming together to control resource spawns and fight over them. And that kind of happens, but not in the way that they wanted it to. They kind of envisaged that endgame deep desert PvP would feature guilds fighting each other, and there'd be people on foot and hand-to-hand combat around crashed starships fighting for the resources contained within, with people in buggies, with gunners and manning the rocket launchers in the back, shooting away at each other, and ornithopters flying overhead, unleashing rocket salvos, and that kind of partially happens. The ornithopter part certainly happens. Everything else, not so much. Because stop and think about this for a moment. Why would you be a guy on the ground with a knife when you can be a guy in the air with an ornithopter and a rocket launcher? So you see the problem. Because endgame PvP in Dune Awakening, for the most part, not 100% entirely, but for the most part, is just a bunch of people flying around in ornithopters shooting rockets at each other and utterly destroying anybody unlucky enough to get caught on the ground. So that's the PvP. How about the PvE? What about the other half of the deep desert? Well, they have delivered exactly what they promised. It's basically exactly the same as the PvP end of the deep desert, except there's no player versus player combat. So it's just you versus the environment. Unfortunately, what this has done has exposed the fact that there is basically nothing to do in Dune Awakening at endgame other than farm the final tier of resources, build the final tier of vehicles, and then nothing. What exactly are you going to do with all of the endgame equipment that you've just harvested the resources for and constructed? Because the game was built around endgame PvP. That is the endgame. And if you're not going to do the PvP, what's the point of farming the resources? Because once you've built everything, then what do? There is literally nothing else to do. And as we've already pointed out, the PvP, even if you do want to do it, is kind of shit. So the game's having a bit of a problem at the moment. Funcom have announced plans to introduce new vehicles and basically mix up the endgame PvP deep desert content to somehow structure it in a way that it doesn't just involve a bunch of people flying around and ornithopters flying rockets at each other. I wish them the best of luck, because honestly, it has the potential to... It really could be great. They just need to work out some of the details. Sounds like the sort of thing that they might have actually noticed and possibly addressed during early access or alpha or beta testing, but, well, better late than never. Honestly, Funcom really do have my sympathies, because it's a lot harder than you might think it is to get players to fight each other in the way that you want them to. Let me give you a couple of examples. Because there are bigger companies than Funcom that have been struggling with this sort of thing for a very, very long time. Blizzard Entertainment, for example. In the first expansion to World of Warcraft, The Burning Crusade, this thing came out nearly 20 years ago. In the starting zone, which was called Hellfire Peninsula, I mean, it was basically a PvE game, but there were certain player versus player objectives in Hellfire Peninsula. If you weren't interested in PvP, you could quite happily ignore them. In fact, the only way to get involved with the PvP objectives in Hellfire Peninsula was for you to consciously make the decision to enable player versus player combat. So it was 100% consensual. Nobody was being forced to do PvP if they didn't want to. Was that there were these 3 structures in Hellfire Peninsula. They're still there now. And they were all PvP flagged. And what was supposed to happen was that players of each faction, Horde or Alliance, were supposed to fight each other for control of these 3 structures. And if your faction managed to control all 3, then you would complete a quest, which you could then hand in for some player versus player gear rewards. All good stuff. So what was supposed to happen was that Horde players would be fighting Alliance players for control of these 3 structures. What actually happened was that people very, very quickly figured out that the fastest and most efficient way to get this quest done and get your rewards was to not fight members of the other faction. What would actually happen was that, let's say these structures started off under control of the Alliance players. The Alliance players would all sit on the sidelines and wait, while the Horde players would run in and then just stand around the flag in the middle of these structures until it had flipped control over to the Horde. Then they would move on to the next one, do the same thing. Then they would move on to the next one and do the same thing. And once the Horde had control of all 3 and they'd completed their daily control the PvP objectives quest, the Alliance players would do exactly the same thing, with the Horde players moving out of the way so the Alliance players could get their daily player versus player quest done as well, all without any actual PvP going on. Pretty much the same thing had happened with what was arguably the single greatest player versus player battleground ever in World of Warcraft's history, the Alterac Valley. This was a maximum level 40 versus 40 faction versus faction battleground that raged for days at a time. I can literally remember queuing up for an Alterac Valley battle game, being in there for 4 hours until I'd had enough, logging off, logging back on the next day, and the same battle was still running. It was glorious. I mean, they really pushed the boat out designing the Alterac Valley battleground. There were so many different objectives, ways that you could help your side win, whether that was fighting for control of the mines so that your side's troops would have better armour and weapons, or fighting for control of the forests and gathering lumber and summoning giant elementals and all kinds of things that just required a mass cohesive effort from your side in order to push the battle line forward. And of course the enemy faction was doing exactly the same thing and trying to interfere with you doing it, fighting for control of towers. There were mini bosses that needed to be taken down. It was amazing, the amount of effort that Blizzard put into setting this thing up as possibly one of the greatest player versus player battlefields in gaming history. Right up until the point when players discovered that the fastest way, the most efficient way to actually do Alterac Valley, because the whole thing that both sides were fighting for was to get to each other's boss and then kill that boss, and whichever side could do that won the battle, and got awarded a whole bunch of honor points and so on and so on and so on. And then it really didn't take players long to realise that, well, if we're here to get the honor points in order to get the PvP gear, then the most efficient way to do that is to actually not fight the enemy players and completely ignore all of the objectives with the exception of the first mini-boss, and then capture 3 towers, and then everybody zerg the final boss once the towers have been flipped, and then the final boss becomes vulnerable. So what was the most glorious PvP experience I have ever had online? Battles that literally used to last days, with multiple objectives surging back and forth across a multi-layered battlefield with 80 players just butchering each other for days on end in the same battle, turned into 40 alliance players starting at the northern end of the map, mounting up and just barreling to the south, passing by 40 horde players all mounted up, literally riding right past each other without exchanging so much as a dirty look, completely ignoring each other, no actual player versus player going on, while they both just rushed to see who could kill the mini-boss, take the 3 towers, and then kill the last boss the fastest. And a battle that would rage on for days was over in 15 minutes. All in the name of most efficiently farming the honour points that you needed to buy the player versus player gear for all the player versus player combat that you weren't actually doing. So Funcom, you have my sympathies. Good luck with that. Have you heard about how McDonald's recently got some egg on its face? A huge security scandal. So, okay. McDonald's now uses an AI hiring platform called mchire.com to screen candidates for jobs with McDonald's. So the hiring process involves a chatbot called Olivia, which has been built by AI firm Paradox.ai, which takes personal application from applicants, points them towards a personality test, and answers basic questions about the company. So, 2 security researchers very recently managed to hack their way into Olivia, gaining access to all kinds of information pertinent to the people who had been speaking to this chatbot, Olivia, in order to apply for jobs with McDonald's. The 2 security researchers managed to get administrator access to the databases containing every single applicant's chat logs and all of their personal information. We're talking about 64 million records containing, but not limited to, things like names, email addresses, phone numbers, addresses, you name it, it's all there. Now, how did they do this? How exactly did they hack this AI chat agent to get access to all this information? Well, after poking around with the chatbot for a bit, they decided to try signing up as a McDonald's franchisee, which is when they found a login link for the Paradox.ai staff to access the site. So they tried 2 of the most common sets of login credentials, username and password admin, and username and password 123456. It was username and password 123456. Now, just to be clear, of the 64 million different records on the database, nobody's details have actually been leaked anywhere. These were security researchers. They were not criminals. They obviously immediately reported their findings to McDonald's, and the security... it's embarrassing to even call it a security loophole. It's just username and password 123456. Honestly, what the hell? I'm just disappointed I don't have a NordPass sponsorship going on this week. McDonald's, are you interested in a secure password manager? Because I have a recommendation. Honestly, this thing just sells itself. Well, anyway, moving on to the final thing that I wanted to talk about this week, and it's probably the biggest gaming news this week, and it's to do with Subnautica 2. The game itself appears to be fine. That's kind of the problem. I should probably explain. So, the issue is, Subnautica 2's developers, Unknown Worlds, and their publisher, Krafton, have had a bit of a falling out. Now, what normally happens in these circumstances is the publisher's, well, pushing to get the game out, whether that's for release or into early access, by a certain financial deadline in order to make an earnings call to their shareholders or whatever. And they're not prepared to listen to the developers saying, look, it's not ready, we need more time. What's happening in this case is the exact opposite, with the 3 senior developers at Unknown Worlds, who go by the names of Charlie Cleveland, Ted Gill and Max Maguire, all insisting that the game is ready to go into early access this year, on schedule. And the publisher, Krafton, saying, no it isn't, we're going to delay it until next year, 2026, and by the way, you 3, you're all fired. So, kind of shocking. And the waters got a little muddy when it was revealed earlier last week that the publisher, Krafton, had promised to pay a bonus of $250 million to the development studio, Unknown Worlds, if they met their publication deadlines, which the three guys in charge of Unknown Worlds all insisted that it was. So you've got the developers saying, it's ready, push it out into early access, and $250 million, please. And the publisher saying, no, it isn't ready. No $250 million for you, and by the way, you're all fired. Now, unsurprisingly, the internet all came down on the side of the development team because, honestly, it did look kind of suspicious. Oh, what's that? $250 million bonus if the game's ready to go? Nope. Screw that. We're keeping a hold of the money. Don't care what the devs say, and if they keep saying it, we're going to sack them. So, your usual publisher shenanigans. However, very recently, a document was leaked, almost certainly deliberately by Krafton, in which it was revealed that there were certain things missing from the current build of Subnautica 2 versus the early access launch specifications which were agreed all the way back in 2023. So these specifications that were supposed to be in place and were agreed upon by both parties before the game was supposed to go into early access are missing 2 biomes, 1 Leviathan. There's a vehicle that isn't in the current build of the game yet. There's an entire game mode that isn't in the current build of the game yet. And I'm quoting here, 1 narrative delayed with about 6 hours of content cut. The publisher then went on to confirm this leaked document, saying, compared to the originally planned early access launch specifications, the current target content volume has been reduced or adjusted across various elements such as biomes, creatures, equipment, progression, and features. Due to a gap between the current state and the content volume assumed during the initial launch planning, it's necessary to reassess the release timeline and roadmap. So what initially looked like your typical scumbag publisher trying to renege on a bonus deal for the hard-working developers is now starting to look like a bunch of greedy developers anxious to get the bonus without actually doing the work that was required to earn the bonus in the first place. Either way, it looks like it's all turned into a big nasty game of he said, she said, and everybody's suing everybody else. What this means for the actual release of Subnautica 2? Honestly, your guess is as good as mine. But things are starting to get really, really ugly between the 3 former developers, Cleveland, Gill and Maguire, and Krafton, the publisher. I mean, they're singling each other out on social media, with Krafton recently saying, we feel a profound sense of betrayal by their failure to honour the trust placed in them. They abandoned the responsibilities entrusted to them, and accusing Cleveland in particular of choosing to prioritise a personal film project over the Subnautica 2 development. So I have no idea what that's all about, but I'm sure it'll all come out in the court case that the 3 of them have just filed against their former employers and the publisher of Subnautica 2, Krafton. Internet drama, best kind of drama. Really glad I've got nothing to do with it. So, yeah, I mean, I'm probably still going to play Subnautica 2 anyway, because the first game was amazing, even if Below Zero was not bad. I think that's probably the best thing we can say about Sub-Zero. Hopefully Subnautica 2 is going to get back on track whenever it's ready for early access, because we all want a sequel that's at least as good as the original game, because the original game was amazing. Oh well, fingers crossed. And on that bombshell, that's it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. Hope you've all enjoyed it. Hope it's given you something to talk about and think about in the comments. And as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.